because like a lot of in some sense like the emergence of Creole happened in the last 200, 300. I don't know how long, like 300 years, right? Like
Yeah.
400
Yeah,
years.
yeah.
Like, no, not even.
17th century, roughly,
Yeah, like
in Haiti.
Is there any other language that are not Creoles that like we know developed in this, like, in the last 400 years? Like,
Well, if what I'm saying is right, then
besides, like,
yeah. So then, well, English itself, modern English, has developed not that long ago, right? Because Middle English was up to 14th, 15th, 16th century. Modern English started developing in the 16th century, 17th century. English the way we know it. So that variety of English is relatively much younger than what Chaucer spoke, right? So right there is a notion of the fact that we call English English can be an illusion because there's been many Englishes throughout the centuries. If we focus on English as a broader umbrella, then of course it's old. But if we focus on English as we speak it now, it's relatively recent. So even that might not make the right cut between, say, and actually sign languages. Did you mention sign languages?
Yes.
Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
in some sense, like maybe part of the bias like could be that even the first the first Haitian, like, I don't know, like, I mean, at some point, like, we were saying that Haitian Creole is a separate language from French, so like,
Yeah.
at some point, like,
Right.
there
was a break. Yeah.
like the first instance that we consider this like a different language like happened fairly recently.
That's right. Yeah.
So like, I was wondering if like kind of to give more evidence that this bias could be racial. Is there any other language that we know has emerged fairly recently, and like see how they treat that differently compared to Creole?
Well, Spanglish, you mentioned Spanglish, right? So one could say that Spanglish might be even younger, right?
It's a lot younger. It's not
Yeah.
like maybe 30, 40.
Yeah.
But but the thing is, it's not considered a language.
Well, actually, it's changing. I heard recently that at some university on the West Coast, in fact, I was told that by Frances Esparza. She told us, actually, me and Noam Chomsky, we had an interview with Noam, and she gave us the news that there's at one university we're going to start teaching Spanglish as a language.
Do you know which one?
You know, I have to listen to the interview again. She did tell us, but I don't remember which one. But it's a first. It's a first in the history of Spanglish. You know, finally there is one university that's agreed to teach Spanglish as a language. You know, and I think that's remarkable, right?
Yeah, it's awesome, but it's not what Jose is talking about. Just because English and Spanish were somewhat prestigious languages in and of themselves, and like the whole point of Creole is that it's like not prestigious.
No,
plus prestigious.
Yeah.
Not like.
So I have to think, because like at the same time I know there's like I don't want to, I have to like because like I know there's a lot of people in Haiti who like them themselves don't think Creole is a language.
Yeah.
So like maybe I'm like being like, oh, Spanish is not a language. Like I don't want to.
Right.
I have to like, but in some sense like it is like it's like when people speak, like, it's because it's, you know, two languages and you're just like, you like purposely mix them because like it's convenient, but like I feel like nobody would say that is a language. Like,
you know, but actually languages have emerged like that. So in Canada there is a language called Michif. Michif is also a mix of French and some Algonquian language. There is one in the Indies called Media Lengua. In fact, even the name tells you that it's a mix of the same sort, right? You know, it's called Media Lengua. What's Media Lengua? It's a mix between Spanish and Quechua. You see, so and Media Lengua is now it's the language of the community. You know, and actually, that case is very interesting actually because Media Lengua was created really midway because you had in the valley you had the rich colonizers, the Spanish people, and in the top of the mountains you had the Quechua speakers, and then in between you had these people who were, in terms of the social class, in the midpoint between the rich Spaniards and the oppressed Quechua speakers, and they bless you, and they developed Media Lengua as a way to showed that they were different, that they were not exactly like the Quechua speakers, but they were not at the level yet of the Spanish speakers, and they used that mixing of. So at first, one could imagine that at first, people would say, well, it's not a language, right? It's just that this random mix of Quechua words and Spanish words. But now, media lengua is a language spoken by a community of people who at first were bilingual, but now their main language is Quechua. Is media lengua.
It's just like with like when you combine English and Spanish, like that's how it feels. Like it doesn't feel like it exactly feels like you're sometimes it's a I really only combine English and Spanish when I know the other person like feels most comfortable speaking that. It's like it just like.
So I think you'll be interested to read about the history of media lengua, because I think what you're describing in terms of that feeling that you know both and that you're speaking to someone who can understand both, that's what's been described by people who've looked at.
Yeah.
So the key linguist here that you should look at, his name is Peter Morskin. Okay, so look up Peter Morskin. Yeah. Okay, so it was a beautiful work describing the origins, the structures of media lengua. And then what you have to do is, as you read that, ask yourself about, is he describing what I feel now when I speak Spanglish? I don't know what the answer is, but that's what comes to my mind. As you describe Spanglish, I think of media lengua.
For example, like most Mexicans don't identify too much with like the use of Spanish as Spanglish. Like it's more like.
Well, that's exactly the way this was created, because media lengua, the speakers wanted to create a new identity for them. Talking about identity, that they didn't want to see themselves as if they were purely Quechua speakers, nor were they Europeans. So they wanted to create this compromise between the two identities. And they use that mix of Quechua and Spanish to create a new badge of identity. Now I don't know whether that is the same thing for Spanglish, but from what you describe, it sounds interestingly reminiscent to that story.
You may have just touched on it, but I was going to ask if he's talking about how Spanish speakers and English speakers don't, the Mexicans don't identify with Spanglish, and they don't speak it. But is that how these speakers of French and Algonquin?
Yeah, Michel.
Is that how they felt in the development of that language?
Well, I think so. Right. So there, so in the history, yeah. Right. So in the so I think the history of Michif has another twist, which is that there was a gender issue. I think there was an issue of there were Algonquian women mating with French speakers. So there is another aspect that's not part of neither Spanglish nor media lengua, which is the gender part of it, having to do with who spoke Algonquin and who spoke French, and it was mostly women who spoke Algonquin. Okay, go ahead.
I feel like there's certain dialects of Spanish that in some ways use Spanglish legitimately, but maybe that's how it would be parquear, which is not how you actually say to park a car, but that would be considered Spanglish, wouldn't it? It's a combination of park and
I don't know if it's
stop worrying about it.
For example, I'm from the border, and we definitely use I'm from Ciudad Juarez, exactly the border, and we definitely use a lot of words that have English origin, parque, they're troca. We use troca instead of camioneta.
Troca.
I didn't know that was the origin until I was 17, 18. For me.
So you're using troca without knowing that it was.
And because it doesn't feel like an English word. You just
troca.
Yeah, you're okay. Of course, that's a Spanish word. But
well,
that doesn't feel like it. Just feels like you're borrowing words, or you're more than something independent. You're sometimes I know I only really combine English and Spanish when I'm speaking with somebody who the baseline is English, but I kind of have to alternate. But
right.
I don't know. It doesn't feel I don't know.
Okay, so that could be an interesting research project, because in this case you would be your own subject, right? So I think that's a fascinating question that you could ask.